starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, welcome to CSG's webinar on addressing cybersecurity threats in the smart grid. My name is Bryden Ross. I'm the Director of Energy and Environmental Policy here at the Council of State Governments in our election and headquarters office. And today we are really lucky to have two bright policy experts with us from the Edison Electric Institute. And I'll go ahead and introduce them to you now, but also I want to give you some logistics information too, just to let you know how we're going to run the webinar today. Everyone will be in listen-only mode. We will have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation, so you can go ahead and type those questions in as you have them, and we'll get them queued up, and we'll address those at the end. But we'll do all questions at the end for our presenters, so they can get through their documents today, and that way we can maybe address some of those questions on the front end for you. Our first presenter is Chris Eisenbrey. Chris joined the Edison Electric Institute in May of 2002 and currently serves as the Director of Business Information. Under his management, his team develops the business information required to support EEI's public policy and advocacy positions. He's also responsible for their external initiatives and collaborative industry activities that are related to smart grid. And he's also EEI Smart Grid Team Leader. Chris is a member of the Smart Grid Interoperability Panel and the North American Reliability Corporation Smart Grid Task Force. And he serves as EEI's staffer for supporting their Chief Information Officer Executive Advisory Committee. Before he joined EEI, Chris served as a manager for information analysis at the Nuclear Energy Institute. And before he served at EEI, Chris served as a project manager at International Access Corporation, which is a consulting firm for public and private sector clients in Asia, including Japanese electric utilities. He was also a research analyst at Aston Associates Incorporated, which is a U.S. Department of Energy contractor. He received his undergraduate degree in politics from the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., and his master's in international business from Johns Hopkins. Our other presenter will be Scott Aaronson. He's the Director of Government Affairs at EEI, and he joined the organization in April of 2009. And he's directly responsible for all advocacy related to several emerging issues like security, telecom, and electric grid modernization. Before he joined EEI, Scott was a senior advisor to several members of Congress, including the former Foreign House Committee Chairman Tom Lantos and his successor, and was the legislative director for Representative Jackie Spear. From 2001 to 2007, he served as an economic policy advisor to U.S. Senator Bill Nelson. And as an aside, that's where I got to know Scott, where we worked together when I worked on Capitol Hill as well. So he's very knowledgeable, and we're lucky to have him here today. Scott attended the University of Colorado at Boulder, where he received his undergraduate degree, and he received his master's degree from the George Washington University. Okay, with that, Chris, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you for joining us. We're looking forward to this discussion today. What I'm going to do is, I know the focus here is mostly on cybersecurity and how that relates to smart grid or vice versa. I thought that not knowing exactly what the level of knowledge is on what smart grid is, or as we like to call grid modernization, that we just do a little basic understanding and information exchange on smart grid. Kind of gets you a sense of what EEI is doing in the policy space, and then we'll turn it over to Scott, who can talk about cybersecurity in general, specifically to smart grid. Next slide. So this is the basic boilerplate of EEI for those of you who aren't familiar with the Edison Electric Institute. To condense these bullets into one statement, we're basically the advocacy group here in Washington for the investor-owned or shareholder-owned electric utilities. Here in Washington, one of those companies would be Pepco Holdings or Potomac Electric Power Company. There's about 72, 75 holding company, utility companies that we represent, and well over 150 of the operating electric utilities. So basically, we do, all of our members work on the Hill on energy and environmental issues. Next, please. So we like to call the smart grid, we like to talk about grid modernization, but the first question that people have when we talk about smart grid is, well, is it dumb? And we like to call it intellectually challenged because, believe it or not, we do have some intelligence on the grid. We do have a lot of high-tech equipment on the grid. It's been called obviously the greatest engineering achievement of the 20th century, I believe. So to call it smart grid, we're going towards smart grid. It doesn't assume that you shouldn't assume that it's a dumb grid. So we call it intellectually challenged. But why is it intellectually challenged? Well, there's three main reasons why the grid needs improvement and modernization. So next click. So right now, the existing grid has what we call limited situational awareness. So your utility that most of you are dealing with, whether it's an IOU, a shareholder-owned electric utility, muni, or co-op, at the local distribution grid does not have a lot of intelligence or awareness of what's going on in the system or what's going on in systems that are connected to your system. So when you have limited situational awareness, outage monitoring is limited. You have to actually rely on customers calling in, and there's a limited ability to remotely fix any problems when there's problems on the grid. So the smart grid, or grid modernization as we like to call it, is working to rectify that limited situational awareness. Next, please. We also have at this time limited system self-healing capabilities. When something happens on the grid, typically a utility will have to go out, get a truck of people together, go out, figure out where the problem is, send a crew out to fix the problem. That costs a lot of money and time. It also, from an environmental point of view, when you have a lot of trucks going out there, and if you can limit those trucks, you have a lot of emissions coming from those vehicles. So the smart grid, or grid modernization, will help to alleviate that problem by putting sensors and analytics on the grid that will be able to tell the utility what the problem is. That's the situational awareness that I spoke about. But then also being able to remotely and dynamically fix the problems rather than having a crew go out and send and throw a switch manually. A lot of this, the limited situational awareness and the self-healing capabilities, and the next leg of the stool that I'm going to talk to you about, all will be helped by one major investment that utilities are doing right now, and that's through smart meters. And I'll get into that in a second. The other issue is limited communications ability. At this juncture, until smart meters are rolled out, smart meters have two-way communication capability. The only way your utility can communicate with you as a customer is through traditional means, through telephone calls, through providing your bills on a monthly basis. The smart meter will allow for two-way communications, and what this will do will allow utilities to share information on price and energy use. It will also allow the utility through the smart meter to understand what neighborhoods, what customers are out during an outage, which will then help speed up the process of restoration. So that's kind of where our grid sits today and what the smart grid is seeking to do. Next slide, please. Utilities are moving towards a smart grid basically for many different reasons. I've mentioned some of them already, but one is to offset some of this new infrastructure investments and increasing the current productivity of the existing grid. So right now, to meet demand, utilities will typically build power lines or power plants, which are actually very expensive. And customers have to pay for these investments through rates that they pay on their bills. The idea behind the smart grid is to try to offset some of that investment by handling some of the demands for energy efficiency, demand response, some of those demand side issues rather than building supply side technology. We've seen increasing amounts of costs on building major transmission and distribution lines. Raw materials such as steel, copper, aluminum, even concrete are at historic levels right now. So the cost to build power plants and transmission lines are also through the roof. So as a utility, we sit back and we're trying to figure out what's the least cost, most efficient way to provide our product to our customers. The smart grid will also, through energy efficiency and also reducing some of these truck rolls, the smart meter also will allow for remote meter reading, so that you're not sending you're not sending utility, whether it's IOUs, co-ops, or munis, staff out to premises to do meter reading. So you add all that together, all the saved truck rolls, and also the energy efficiency and demand response of not having to run as many power plants, and you'll get measurable environmental benefits. Also, the smart grid will allow for more renewable energy to be connected to the grid, and that will also obviously bring about some environmental benefits. Sub-bullet here, we see the smart grid as, and I think the administration, the Obama administration also sees the smart grid as a major component of what they said in the State of the Union address back in January of an all-of-the-above energy strategy. So it's definitely a part of that all-of-the-above energy strategy. And we're not taking our cues from the Obama administration per se. We've always believed in diversity, fuel diversity, the types of fuel we use, the types of power plants we build. We just view energy efficiency, demand response, and smart grid being able to enable those things as another tool in our toolbox in that strategy. Smart grid will also empower customers to control and optimize their energy usage. Right now, in the existing, without a smart meter, you do not know how much power you're using. You do not know which appliances are using what amount of power until you get that bill at the end of the month. The smart meter through the smart grid will hopefully, and we believe will, allow customers to see and manage their power going forward, so they can make changes as they go along to help manage their bills. We also are seeing a movement in the United States and other countries from a central station generation approach to more distributed generation at the distribution level. So typically right now, you get your power from a coal plant, a nuclear plant, a combined cycle gas plant. Those electrons are transmitted over the power lines, and you consume them as whether you're a commercial, industrial, or a residential customer. A lot of, especially in the commercial and industrial customer base, a lot of those companies, whether it's a Walmart, whether it's a Walgreens, whether it's a Home Depot, are starting to look at siting smaller power plants or distributed generation, especially wind and solar, at the local on-site premises. To be able to do that, you need a distribution grid that is very dynamic and is able to react to some of the power flows that are going on that typically central generation doesn't bring about. We're also hoping, as the electric utility industry, that our product is going to be used in new and innovative ways. And one of the major things that we're looking at is using electricity as a fuel for vehicles and our transportation system. But to do so, because the vision is that you'll have electric vehicles hooking up to the grid, charging at peak times and as well as off-peak times, you need a grid that will be able to manage and optimize around those new sources of, not only sources, but sinks of energy. Of course, as I mentioned in the first slide, we want to increase our reliability and efficiency through some of that situational awareness, the communications aspects. But we also think that the smart grid is going to provide the foundation for some future economic growth. We have a large, we're in an area right now where we're having a lot of long-time employees in our industry who bring certain skill sets starting to retire from the industry, and we need to start attracting the more of the high-tech, high-skilled, IT-focused, communications-focused types of workers, and we think the smart grid is the platform to be able to do so. Next slide, please. Because we're an advocacy group, we're always trying to let people know in our country how our members, our member companies, shareholder-owned electric utilities are doing and are being successful. This just gives you a sense of the amount of our members that are doing some of this innovative smart grid related stuff. Just to give you a sense, I mentioned we represent about 70 companies, 150 operating companies, but we make up about 75% of the suppliers of electricity in this country. So we're a very big piece of the pie. So as you can see from this slide, we're also a very, not only a very big piece of the pie, but we are also a very innovative piece of the pie. Next slide. Now, over the last couple of years, as I've been in smart grid, a lot of the focus and drive behind the smart grid has been at the federal level with DOE, other agencies, FERC, NERC. Well, NERC's not an agency, but they're definitely nationally focused, and the Department of Commerce through the National Institute for Standards and Technologies have been and the Obama administration have been driving the smart grid, the push towards creating a smarter grid. A lot of you probably saw that we did have a lot of stimulus money from the stimulus legislation a couple years ago. About $4.5 billion was geared towards smart grid. So right now we're looking at not only what's happening from a federal government support, but also what's happening on the ground. And we're seeing, Department of Defense is also another major player in this area, but we're seeing colleges and universities and commercial customers doing a lot and asking for a lot of these distributed resources, things called like microgrids, where we have Department of Defense bases that are very concerned about the reliability of the system, even though we have incredible reliability of our system. But they are looking into how they can manage their own energy needs without the assistance of electric utilities. So all of this is coming together and changing the nature of the grid. Next slide, please. So this is some of the information I gave you before. We have the stimulus awards that are pushing things. We have the White House's Smart Grid Subcommittee policy framework development that we've done over the last couple of years. It's basically trying to create a framework, a policy framework at a national level that will support the move towards grid modernization, smart grid. We have a lot of activity at NIST on what's called smart grid interoperability standards, creating those standards that will allow all these different devices to communicate with the existing and the future grid. And of course, we've got a lot of early adopters on smart meters, especially in California and Texas, but we're seeing millions of meters on the smart meters on the system right now, and we're expecting about 65 million on the grid in the next 3 years. So next, please. So again, the grid is from a policy point of view, and that's why I think Scott and I are on this call. There's a change in direction and focus on what's going on in smart grid in 2012, and this is, I think, lines up with some of the audience that we have on the phone, or most of the audience that we have on the phone. That the focus on smart grid is shifting from federal to state level issues, and some of the issues that we're dealing with that are right in the middle of our focus are the customer acceptance of smart grid. Also, what are the business opportunities that utilities and other players in the smart grid will be able to take advantage of? And also, what regulatory changes do we need to implement going forward to make this a success? So some of the, I'm going to touch a little bit on some of the smart grid acceptance issues. And I think cybersecurity, though it's not on this list, and it probably should be, is definitely something that has been raised as concern. I'm going to let Scott talk about that a lot more. But I would say these top, 9 issues are what we're dealing with at a very local level, and a lot of you on the phone have probably read about or are actually dealing with this hands-on right now. So we had some concerns about the accuracy of the meters when the smart meters were rolled out. We had a situation in California where it was a perfect storm, where the meters were rolled out during the very hot summer months when electric power is the most expensive, especially in this part of California, east of Los Angeles, near Bakersfield, where at the same time, not only was there the rollout of new technology, a hot, dry summer with very high temperatures, but also California was going through had just implemented a new rate structure or rate tiers. So all that came together in a perfect storm where people were having their meters installed, and all of a sudden their bills went up. So they made, they did a 2 + 2 = 4 when it should have been, but that was not the case. So we've gotten past that issue right now. We found out that the meters actually were tested in both California and Texas, and they're actually more accurate than the analog meters that you probably have on your homes today. We also have an issue with radio frequency. Just like your cell phone, just like your microwave at home, just like your Wi-Fi that you have in your home, smart meters produce radio frequency, or they work on a radio frequency band. There's been a lot of concern from customers that radio frequency from smart meters, like there is concern, unfounded concern that is, from smartphones. Scott, you better put your phone down. That radio frequency is going to be causing some health concerns. We're dealing with that in areas like Florida and also in Maryland right now, where opponents to smart grid and smart meters are using radio frequency and health concerns as a major area to push back in. Both those issues, along with privacy concerns, which is the fourth bullet, have caused a situation where public utility commissions are looking at offering an opt-out option for customers. Basically, even though they've approved the deployments of smart meters and AMI and smart grid, they are looking into giving customers the option to say thank you, but no thanks to the utilities. The main issue there is, though it's a small amount of people who are choosing these opt-out in some states like California and Vermont and Maine, I believe, it still causes some planning and deployment issues for the utility. But the main issue is, well, the plans have been approved, so some of the customers are being asked through these opt-out options to pay for the cost that the utility has to incur to meter read and other things that go along with the traditional analog meters. There's issues around cost of installation. This is a very big investment by our members, 65 million meters. I don't have an average on how much each meter costs, but I've heard the range, depending on what the functionality is, between $200 and $400 per meter. That adds up. Privacy concerns is a big concern, that now meters have this two-way communication, that they'll be able to know what you're doing in your home, be able to send information from your home to the utility. So there is a big brother aspect out there that we're dealing with. Cybersecurity is the other issue. Scott will deal with that. There's the impact on at-risk customers. Again, these are, with any new technology, there's an upfront investment, and then benefits will flow. But we do have customers that we consider at risk, that are, some people would say, are low-income customers. There are customers who are on fixed income. There are the elderly. There are the AARP constituency. There's been a lot of pushback from those groups. Along with that, there's concerns about dynamic pricing, and that's the way that the pricing structures that are developed that will allow people to understand what the smart meter will tell them, how much power they're using, and at what cost, so that people can change their consumption behaviors. There's the issue of overpromising by vendors and others. The utilities are not, though we're investing, we have not been pumping up the notion of the smart grid the way that some of the vendors have. We see it as an investment. We see it as a way to increase reliability, to increase energy efficiency, and some of the vendors in the industry have, basically are overpromising some of the benefits at this point. So next slide, please. So here's just two examples of regulator pushback. This deals with the opt-out issue. So as you can see, in California and in Maine, there are opt-out plans in place on smart grid, and that I believe there's 14 to 15 other states that either are looking at it from a legislative point of view or a regulatory point of view right now. Next, please. So I just wanted to end it with some of the things that EEI is doing related to smart grid and smart meter, and this webinar is part of that process. So we've done some research for our members on smart grid, and when I say research, I mean testing, finding out what people know about it, what they don't know about it, what their concerns are, what they want from a smart grid, from their smart meter. We've also then taken to the next step of developing some messages for us to use in our various venues, and also to share with other groups to use in various venues. So we've developed messages, 4 basic messages around smart grid. We've created a toolkit for our member companies to help them communicate as we're communicating right now on smart grid and smart meters. And then I would say this call is both educational, but it's also a little bit of advocacy, in that we want to start with some education on some of the major public policy and policy makers out there, and we appreciate this opportunity to do so today. Next, please. Because we only have an hour, I didn't want to take up too much of the time, but I did want to leave you with a resource that you could go to if you still have questions. We have a website called smartgrid.eei.org. The website has 5 basic areas that you can get the basics. You can follow the news that's out there if you're interested in this topic. You can explore the research out there, whether it's research on investing in smart grid, or whether it's research around some of those pushback issues at the local level, the cybersecurity, the privacy, and the potential health impacts. We have we're using social media through Twitter and Facebook, Blogger, those types of sites, to help people stay informed on the issue of smart grid. And of course, we have a member company-only communications toolkit. So we're trying to, as an industry, try to communicate about smart grid from one voice, and trying to learn from, trying to share knowledge from companies that are going through the transition right now, and share that knowledge to companies who may be going through that transition in the very near future. So with that, I guess we'll be taking questions at the end. Appreciate your time, and I'm going to hand it over to Scott.
Well, thank you, Chris, and hi to everybody. As Bryden mentioned at the beginning, Scott Aaronson, I'm a lobbyist here at the Edison Electric Institute, focusing on emerging technology issues, cybersecurity being the one that's sort of most active these days. Before I dive into that, Chris said something that jogged my memory that I wanted to get across about the investment that our companies are making in the smart grid. Not only are companies making this investment, but the administration made a very large investment during the stimulus package back in '09 because of all the benefits that Chris alluded to, whether it's getting more renewables on the grid, better situational awareness, better reliability, better just better customer control and support. They view this as part of their all-of-the-above energy strategy. And so a lot of the hiccups that this industry has had to overcome are actually shared by the administration. So while we may have differences of opinion on some environmental policies and other aspects of how utilities are regulated, when it comes to smart grid rollout, we are actually supporting the administration because we are supporting their investment, which in turn supports our investment. And then just more sort of, I don't know, from a comic standpoint, I suppose, the RF issue. I hope the irony is not lost on the folks who are probably calling your offices, calling their PUCs, and calling their members of Congress. They are probably calling from cell phones and complaining that the RF from their smart meter is going to give them brain cancer. So take that for whatever it's worth. What I'm going to do is dive into the cybersecurity portion of things. I will explain how we as an industry talk about cybersecurity. And I'll quickly blast through what's going on Capitol Hill, and then I'll bring it back to you guys and sort of the state-level issues. And then we can have hopefully a bit of a dialogue with some questions at the end. So next slide, please. Sorry. How we talk about these issues. First and foremost, the principles that I'm about to run through, while they are EEI investor-owned talking points for all intents and purposes, this is one of those few instances where the entire electric utility industry is actually on the same page. EEI is part of a very broad coalition that involves the co-ops, the munis, the large industrial customers, the Canadians, because this is, after all, a North American electric grid. We've been working very closely with NARUC on this. They have very similar views to ours as to how cyber ought to be regulated and how we ought to be securing the grid. I guess one of the questions you all should be asking yourself is sort of why cyber? Obviously, it has an impact for national and economic security, but it also has an impact where it's related to smart grid. As we automate the grid, as we introduce this digital overlay that is going to make the grid, quote unquote, more intelligent, give us that better situational awareness, that digital overlay introduces new vulnerabilities. And so it is our preference that those vulnerabilities are mitigated on the front end, that we bake security in. It's always more expensive to retrofit something as complicated as, the electric grid than it is to do it on the front end as we're doing this modernization. So that should tell you that we as an industry, believe it or not, are for cybersecurity legislation. Now, the principles that we think cybersecurity legislation ought to abide by are the 4 points that you see in front of you. And I'll go one by one. So, limiting scope of any new emergency authority to imminent cyber threats against truly critical assets. Basically, you can distill that into one word: focus. We want to make sure that we're not trying to protect everything from everything. We want to make sure that that we are focusing on the most imminent threats to the most critical infrastructure. I'll explain why we think we're in a good spot on sort of the vulnerabilities, not a threat, not the thing that is coming at us right now, in a second as I get to the fourth point. But let's go one by one. So second point, we want to include all critical infrastructure sectors. There's two reasons for that. One is misery loves company. The other is you can't say that you have protected the electric grid unless you also protect the industries that we rely on. We rely on water to cool our systems. We rely on transportation to move our fuel. We rely on telecom to operate. We rely on financial services to trade our product. So all of those critical infrastructure industries are integral to the operation of the electric grid. So when we say that we want comprehensive, holistic legislation, it means that we want something that regulates and has oversight of all critical infrastructure sectors, not going one by one. Third, encourage more information sharing. This is something we'll talk a lot more about as I get through what's going on Capitol Hill right now. But the easy way to talk about it is we do not have, we, the utility industry, do not have standing armies. We do not have intelligence gathering capability. We need the federal government to tell us what we don't know. The flip side of that is the federal government doesn't necessarily have expertise operating an electric system. So they need us. This is clearly a shared responsibility. This is clearly critical infrastructure is something that is for the national and economic security. We don't take that responsibility lightly, but we can't protect the things and we can't fix the things that we don't know about. So better information sharing, including classified information, to those targets would be helpful. I skipped around a little bit when I started talking about number one. Number four talks about building on the existing Federal Power Act process. And this is someplace where you guys from the state level obviously have an interest too. The Federal Power Act, Section 215 in particular, is all about the regulatory structure. At the state and local level, or at the distribution level of the utility system, the state PUCs have oversight. At the federal level, at the bulk power system level, that is where FERC and NERC come into play. What we want to make sure of is that we're not, and it's important to note that we are the only industry, and I can't stress this enough, the only industry that currently has mandatory and enforceable cybersecurity standards. So there's not a need necessarily to reinvent the wheel. FERC and NERC are extremely good at protecting the bulk power system, the system that would have the most impact on national and economic security. when we talk about limiting scope to emergency authority imminent cyber threats and critical assets, one of the ways you can think about that is a threat is a thing that by definition is imminent. A threat is the planes are in the air, the bombs are coming, we know about a bad thing that is going to happen. A vulnerability is a thing that by definition may be exploited at a later date. What NERC is able to do, and hopefully I assume that you all sort of understand the FERC-NERC relationship, but just quick history lesson, NERC came out of the 1968 New York blackout. In the 2005 Energy Policy Act, they were actually given a new role as the Electric Reliability Organization. So they're sort of quasi-governmental. The beauty of what NERC is able to do is they are a body of stakeholders. If you think of the electric grid as one big machine with thousands of owners, users, and operators, you need to make sure that all those owners, users, and operators are rowing in the same direction. What NERC does is sets the standards, both operational and physical security and cybersecurity, that are then mandatory and enforceable by FERC with $1 million a day penalty authority. So NERC's responsibility is to make sure that the standards can withstand the test of time, that there aren't going to be operational consequences, and then FERC is in charge of enforcing those. So as I said, we believe that our existing regulatory model does a very good job of dealing with vulnerabilities at the bulk power system level. Where we do think there is a gap in authority is for those emergencies, and that's why we are for legislation. So next slide, and we're going to bounce through this one real quickly. Are you ready for Cyber Week? It's going on right now. The answer is maybe. We can go to the next slide. Cyber Week is something that the House is doing to basically draw attention to the cybersecurity legislation that they are going to consider, and then hopefully pass over the course of the next 24 hours and then throw over to the Senate. I'll talk about the Senate in a minute. Just to tell you what's going on in the House, there are 4 bills. One that's going to deal with public-private information sharing, one that is 2 that are dealing with research and development for expanding the cyber workforce, for improved technology, things like that, and then a last one to deal with called FISMA reform to deal with government computer networks. What is interesting are the 2 bills that didn't make the cut for Cyber Week. The GRID Act, which is the Grid Reliability and Infrastructure Defense Act from the Energy and Commerce Committee, who has jurisdiction specifically over the electric grid. I think leadership recognized that we did not want to do this piecemeal, sort of critical infrastructure sector by critical infrastructure sector, so that one is on the back burner. A DHS bill to provide DHS regulatory authority didn't make the cut either, and I can explain why that is when we get into the Senate stuff. So next slide. And I'm just going to bang through each of these real quickly, so I'm sorry to whoever's clicking. 2096 is Cybersecurity Enhancement Act. That's science and technology. It's all about making sure that we have better human and technical resources to deal with cybersecurity. Next slide. FISMA reform, told you about that one. That's government computer networks, motherhood and apple pie. Everybody thinks the government should be better protected as well, and they need to lead by example. Next slide. This is the interesting one, and this is the one that is causing the most consternation right now, so I will spend a couple of seconds talking about it. It is CISPA, the Cyber Intelligence Sharing and Protection Act. This is the only piece of legislation so far that EEI and the broad industry coalition I referenced before is actively supporting. It is bipartisan with over 100 co-sponsors. Chairman Mike Rogers from Michigan of the House Intelligence Committee has been a great champion for getting better information to the private sector. He is joined by his ranking member, Doug Ruppersberger from Maryland, and together they are trying to move this. There is some concern within the privacy community that this is very much like the Patriot Act, and it's big, scary government and big, bad corporations sharing information about private network usage. The sponsors of the bill are actively working with the privacy community, whether it's ACLU, the Center for Democracy and Technology, other civil libertarian groups, to try to allay those fears and basically say that any information that's gleaned by the government from information sharing between both the private sector and the government can only be used to prosecute these cyber crimes. So basically, if a bank feels it's been hacked, they provide information to the NSA, and in the course of the investigation, NSA figures out that you've been laundering money. They can't. That is inadmissible evidence, and so that's what they're trying to work out. Like I said, we are strong proponents of this information sharing bill, and we'll hopefully be seeing it pass at some point tomorrow. There's also a fear that it will be SOPA'd. SOPA is now a verb, apparently. That is the bill that was derailed earlier this year that was dealing with online piracy, not privacy, piracy, that the internet just got up in arms about and was able to quash. What's interesting about this is, first of all, this is not about regulating the internet. This is not about keeping the internet from being the free platform that it is. And this is about national economic security, and so that is the case that we're trying to make. Next slide. And actually, you can skip 2 ahead. I've already talked about what's not in Cyber Week. So, the Senate. The Senate's in a stalemate right now. They have essentially 2 competing bills that are far broader in scope than the sort of rifle shots that the House is doing. What the Senate's got is a Homeland Security bill, and now I'll explain what our concerns are with respect to how interjecting DHS into this could be bad. Actually, I'll get that in a second. But they've got a Homeland bill that would essentially give DHS responsibility to regulate all of the critical infrastructure sectors specific to covered critical infrastructure. There are Republicans who are ranking members of various other committees of jurisdiction, the committees who have oversight of all the critical infrastructure sectors, so whether it's energy and the electric grid, or commerce and the telecommunications system, or banking and the financial services system. All of those ranking members are not thrilled with the idea of ceding jurisdiction and ceding control specifically for cyber to the Homeland Security Committee or to the Department of Homeland Security. So what they did is introduce an alternative, actually known as the GOP alternative, championed mostly by John McCain from Arizona. And what they're essentially saying is they encompass essentially the 4 House bills that are moving. Let's do FISMA reform. Let's get the government set up. Let's do information sharing. Let's do science and tech, sort of R&D, human resources, better cyber workforce. We'll see which wins the day, but right now neither is going to get the 60 votes, so we have ourselves an old-fashioned Senate stalemate. And Bryden and I, having worked in the Senate together, know that those are not easy to overcome. Next slide. So, well, I already talked a bit about how the Senate Homeland Security Committee draft is working. We can go to the next slide, and I'll get just a little bit more 50,000-foot level. Essentially, the way the HSGAC bill, Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, the HSGAC bill will work is they will do sector-by-sector risk assessments. They will find which assets are truly critical, and they will designate those. For those, they will develop performance requirements. So basically, what minimum threshold of security do you need to live up to with respect to those, to that CCI, that covered critical infrastructure. And then they will analyze and assess whether or not those performance requirements have been achieved. Next slide, please. This is the McCain statement about what his concern is with DHS playing this role. I'll let you all read it, but to summarize, it actually mirrors some of the concerns that we would have. And this is something that you all should think about, too, coming from the state level. If you think about the way the electric grid is regulated, I already explained it, you've got the state PUCs who are looking at it at the distribution level, and they are doing all of the economic regulation, but also some of the physical and even cyber regulation as it relates to the distribution level, and certainly to the smart grid. If you then look at the bulk power system, you've got FERC and NERC and all the wonderful things that NERC is doing by having the stakeholders at the table, and then FERC enforcing what they do. They do operational standards, they do physical security standards, and they do cyber standards. If you then overlay DHS into that, only for covered critical infrastructure, which, first of all, sort of an unknown quantity. Okay, what is covered critical infrastructure? And then once you figure out what is covered critical infrastructure, it evolves over time. Today's covered critical infrastructure may not be tomorrow's, and vice versa. So it took me 30 seconds just to explain that new regulatory structure. Imagine implementing it. We are scared of that. Next slide, please. The Secure IT or Secure It bill is the GOP alternative, and I've already explained that a little bit. Next slide. One of the concerns that we have is embodied in something that the Senate did about 2 months ago. They did a tabletop exercise that focused on just the electric grid, New York City in particular, and talked about all of the awful things that would happen to critical infrastructure if the grid were compromised. A couple of interesting notes about this. Nobody from FERC or NERC was invited. DOE was there, but, quote, they had a seat in the back of the room. What we're up against with people who are talking about cybersecurity is as much a policy concern as it is a PR concern. Everybody likes to talk about how the entire eastern seaboard would go into a blackout for 6 to 12 months and it would be anarchy and the world would come to an end. I've read The Road. It's very scary, but there are a lot of things that would have to happen in order for that to happen, first of all. Second, the grid is incredibly resilient. It is built to specifications that are N minus whatever to ensure that there is enough resiliency and redundancy built in. And if you take the New York blackout of 2003 as an example, that blackout did not cascade down the eastern seaboard. No spinning equipment was damaged, and power was back on in 48 to 72 hours. Now, I don't want to dismiss the scariness of a prolonged outage because of a cyber attack, but what we're up against is an episode of 24 that everybody wants to talk about and put on the front page of the newspaper, but what we have in reality is an issue of popular mechanics. There are a lot of reasons why it can't cascade. There is a lot of reasons why there is resiliency, and there are a lot of things that we can do after what's called 0 day. Okay, something that we couldn't foresee happened, and now how do we get back up and running? There are a lot of very creative ways to make sure that we can at least get critical load supported in very short order. Next slide, please. And this is just Senator Murkowski, who's the ranking member of the Senate Energy Committee, sharing her concern that the administration, and the Senate leadership were essentially, playing Chicken Little and not looking for real solutions by inviting people like FERC and NERC to the conversation to actually lend a little bit of credibility and context to the things that the grid already is able to withstand. Next slide, please. That one pretty much speaks for itself. To put it bluntly, right now I think there's a veto threat standing against the CISPA bill. That's the Rogers-Ruppersberger Information Sharing Bill. There is all sorts of privacy concerns there. There's the standoff that we've got in the Senate. While this is the kind of issue that it is sexy, it gets members of Congress on the front page of newspapers. It is a national security issue. It is largely bipartisan. Those are the kinds of things that can get done in an election year. But I am not terribly optimistic, as you can tell, that Congress can get it back together to actually move these bills right now. So what we're going to do over the course of the summer, when I think when Congress goes to its respective corners and they start campaigning and legislation starts stagnating, is we're going to be going on a bit of a charm offensive, and this goes to what Chris was talking about as part of our broader advocacy initiatives and education and outreach, to explain all of the things that we are already doing, to explain where the gaps in authority currently lie, and then to try to get some good legislation teed up for early next year. Next slide. I just started talking about this. The other thing that we're doing, besides the mandatory enforceable standards and talking about all the things that we're already capable of doing, we are working with the government. We are working with DOE on what they're calling a cybersecurity maturity model. Basically, how ready is each company for a cyber attack? And not all companies are created equal. Without naming names, we have companies who operate in 14 states and who have 7 to 10 million customers. we have tiny ones who are distribution only and who don't necessarily have the resources to to secure their own system. So it runs the gamut. Like I said, we're working with the co-ops and the munis. Some of them can be very small as well. But because the grid is interconnected, we are only as strong as our weakest link, and the intent is, a rising tide will raise all ships. And I've told this to a lot of people. I am incapable of talking in anything but metaphors. Next, please. So now bringing it back to where you all are at from a state perspective as it relates to cybersecurity. A few years ago, Gary Brown, the chair of the New York State Commission, Public Utility Commission, was asked, how are the states doing with respect to cybersecurity? His quote was, "It's a mixed bag." That basically screams for the need for federal oversight. And there absolutely is a federal component to this. But the states guard their jurisdiction jealously, and there's good reason. State PUCs are there as economic regulators. They are there to control the costs. The other thing that Gary Brown said at that particular hearing is, I can build you a system that will protect against 99.99% of all of the things that you could ever possibly imagine. There's two problems with that. One is it will cost customers $1,000 a kilowatt hour. And the other is there's still 0.01% of things that we just can't possibly guard against. Anybody who tells you that they can protect against everything is either lying or trying to sell you something. So, I think that there remains a role for the state regulators, there remains a role for state legislators, there remains a role for the states to be a partner with securing those systems and to be partners with, or to be available after an attack happens. Part of what we need to do is plan for post-disaster recovery. We do that with storms. We do that very effectively through mutual assistance. It shouldn't be any different with cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is simply a reliability issue. Instead of an act of God, it's an act of man, period. So those are the kinds of things that we are doing. In addition to the Cybersecurity Maturity Model, EEI is working with no one less than the Chertoff Group, former Secretary of Homeland Security Chertoff, to identify some of the threats that are facing the grid and to begin culling and cultivating best practices so that, again, the rising tide can lift all boats and our better performing companies can provide some insight to maybe our more cautious companies who haven't necessarily dove in headfirst into the cyber landscape. And then the other thing that we are doing with respect to cyber is some high-level CEO to government official meetings. So a small group of CEOs will be meeting with Secretaries Napolitano and Chu in the coming weeks, and part of that is post-disaster planning. We learned from Fukushima that it's better to have a plan in place before a disaster happens than try to invent it afterwards. So again, while Fukushima is, it was a natural disaster that morphed into, a catastrophic disaster, we think that cyber and other national level catastrophes deserve a little bit of pre-planning ahead of time. So we're working on that with the government. Next slide, please. And this is my last one. I've pretty much touched on all of this, in one way or another. But just to recap, the transmission versus distribution issue is relevant. The distribution level is traditionally regulated by the state PUCs, and it should be. Cost does need to be a concern. No one likes to talk about cost as it relates to cybersecurity, because how can you put a price on protection of the nation? But you have to. It's not about putting a price on it. It's about doing a cost-benefit analysis and making sure we're focusing our resources on the right things. Cost versus risk. Just talked about that. Economic regulators. That's what you all are, and what your state PUCs are doing, and that needs to be a part of the discussion. As it relates to deployment of the smart grid, there's two ways to think about it. As vendors sell new widgets that will modernize the grid, those need to have cybersecurity baked in. There are national standards to that effect, and that's what NIST is working on. That's what we are working on from a national and federal level. But with respect to the actual deployment and the decisions that are made at the state level as to whether or not they're going to be deployed, how they're going to be deployed, what the requirements are going to be, what the minimum standards will be that you all are willing to live by, you have a seat at that table too, and NARUC has been an integral part of the NIST process, as well as some of the other standards-making organizations that are figuring out what minimum standards smart grid needs to live up to. So I will take a breath, and hopefully you guys caught some of that. Unfortunately, the webinar, so you can rewind it at your leisure, but that concludes everything that I have to say about cyber and legislation currently pending.
Well, Chris and Scott, thank you very much. I really appreciate your perspective today and sharing your insight. And we'll go ahead and turn it over to some questions now. I know we've got a few more minutes here, and I want to encourage anyone who's got questions to go ahead and send them in. Our first question that we received is, do you have information on smart grid programs in Canada, and where do you find those?
That's a good question. You know, EEI is primarily a domestic. We focus a lot of our time on here in the U.S., but we do have an international program here where a lot of members from all over the country. There's another association in Canada called the Canadian Electricity Association, which probably has a lot more information on that than we do. But we do know that smart grid is very prevalent, especially metering, smart metering in Ontario. I know that Hydro-Quebec, and a very large utility in Canada, is also doing it. I know that there's a lot of activity in British Columbia. It tends to be on the coast with the high population centers, you know, in BC and Ontario and Quebec. So I don't have a lot of detail on it, but to answer the question simply is that there is a lot of activity in Canada. We work with our partners in Canada through the Canadian Electricity Association. I'd be happy to follow up with getting some information, whether it's a document or some kind of matrix that may explain that, drill it down a little bit better for you. So if you send me an email, and I think that maybe CSG here could probably send our email addresses out to you.
Okay.
So that's kind of my answer right there. So.
All right. That's great. Well, I'll definitely follow up with you there, Chris, and get the information out to our callers. Another question that we have, what are the biggest threats, in your opinions, for a cyber attack, and what can states do to help prevent these attacks from happening and protect critical infrastructure?
So I'll take that one. Based on our research and work with the Chertoff Group, it sort of falls into three categories. One is, and the one that the state would be most sort of state specific, and those are your more criminal type attacks. The stereotype of the kid in his mom's basement, but even just to hack a smart meter and try to not have to pay their bill, things like that. That's one level, and those don't have an impact on national and economic security, so we don't focus on those quite as much. But that is something that I think law enforcement and the states are going to be particularly concerned about, and that our companies are concerned about. It's just not part of the national dialogue. The other two are sort of the big ones, and then you're talking about well-funded rogue criminal organizations, and I would include in that terrorist cells. And then the last is nation states, and nation states are constantly probing networks, constantly probing supervisory control and data acquisition SCADA systems, trying to infiltrate. If you think about what we did in Iraq when we first went to war, we took out all of their infrastructure. Well, with planes and bombers. Well, imagine if you could do that remotely. That is something that, in an act of war, is the first thing that an enemy would do. So those are sort of the three categories it falls into. The one that I would be most concerned about from a state perspective is more your hacker, hacktivist, small-time criminal, etc.
Okay. When one more here. I know we're getting close on time, but I think this is more of a fundamental smart grid question that may be in Chris's bailiwick. It really gets to the difference between what smart grid technology is and smart meters. How are they different? Is this really kind of more of a systematic process or just one technology? I don't know if you wanted to to go back over that one more time?
Yeah, sure. Smart grid is kind of a catch-all brand almost for what we're calling grid modernization. If you know anything about the grid or a little bit about the grid, you know it's made up of many components. You've got generation, transmission, distribution, all the way down to the consumer. We view smart grid as going across the full spectrum of the grid. Our companies are putting what are called synchrophasers, and I promised I wouldn't say that word in this webinar, but I broke my own rule. Synchrophasers on the grid to provide that wide situational awareness, to be able to anticipate that something might be happening over in another part of the grid that may cascade and cause a problem on my part of the grid. So more of a diagnostic tool at the transmission level. On the distribution side, you've got distribution automation. You've got dynamic switches and reclosers. You've got analytics. You've got IT. You've got telecommunications on the grid. Smart meters are just a very good tool in the whole smart grid toolkit. It is a component of smart grid. A lot of people, because smart meters have been in the news a lot, both good and bad, are putting an equal sign between smart grid and smart meters. And it's our job at EEI to say, well, yes, smart meters are a very pivotal part of that approach. It's not the only answer. We do much more beyond that. We invest a lot more in the grid than just smart meters. And so it's more, smart grid is more of a holistic, I'd say.
Okay. Well, thanks for that very succinct wrap up there. I want to let all our participants know that we'll send a link out for the webinar very soon, so you can review this at your leisure and go back and catch some different issues that you'd like to review again. We'll send that out shortly, and also we'll send out Chris and Scott's email information as well, so you can get in touch with them if you have more specific policy questions. And always feel free to reach out to me at bross@csg.org if I can help you track down anything. I think that concludes today's webinar. Thanks again, guys, for your great presentations. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.